This is a flower. You guys see it?
Yeah.
No, I mean this one. Do you see that? So that's one flower. Here's a close-up of it. You can see it has 5 petals, and then there's this piece that sticks out in the middle. The darker part of that with the stripes has the pollen, and then the fuzzy yellow bit sticking out is the female part that receives pollen from other flowers. So this is a sunflower, but the head of the sunflower has hundreds, or in some of the larger ones can even have thousands of individual flowers. So again, each one of these is a complete flower with male and female parts. When it's pollinated, it will develop into 2 sunflower seeds. Each one of those will become 2 sunflower seeds. So, hundreds or thousands of flowers on this object here. But what are flowers for? Well, these are for you, and my friend Dan is going to go and pass a few out and make sure each table gets 1 or 2.
Okay.
So those flowers that are being passed out right now are called black-eyed Susans. Some of you have probably seen them before. They're a native plant that grow wild around here. This is a specific type of black-eyed Susan called Rudbeckia subtumentosa. And if you look at them real close and you have really good vision, you might be able to see those individual little flowers. They sort of look like sunflowers, and that's not an accident. They're very closely related plants. And they have that same quality where the flower itself is made up of in this case, dozens of tiny flowers. So there's lots of plants that have this characteristic where what we think of as the flower is botanists call it a capitulum, which is just Latin for head. It's a flower head, but it actually contains multiple flowers. There's a whole huge group of plants that have this characteristic. It's called Asteraceae, and it is a plant family. Family in the taxonomic sense, right? So you've got kingdom, phylum, order, family, genus, species. So family is kind of midway on the way that we classify plants. There's 415 other plant families besides Asteraceae. But Asteraceae includes a lot of interesting plants. So this is a coneflower. You guys have probably seen this before, right? And again, you can see dozens of little flowers in that flower head, right? Daisies are in this family. Dandelions, they all have the same characteristic, right? You can see the multiple flowers in the same flower head. Even lettuce is in this family. So if you let the lettuce in your garden bloom, you'll see these little flowers that look like this, that have these multiple flowers on them, right? So this plant family is old. In fact, it's been around for 83 million years, which, is a long time. So we're going to talk a little bit about things that happen on an evolutionary time scale. So I want to just talk about how we understand the scale of time. If this box represents 1 million years, that red stripe is the amount of time that human beings have been around, about 200 or 300,000. And then this little red stripe is all of recorded history. Okay, so that's 1 million years. Here's 83 million years. This is how long the family Asteraceae, that includes all those plants we just talked about, has been around. Interestingly enough, it's thought that all the plants in this family share a common ancestor that was probably was a plant that lived in what's now South America. And then it diversified into a bunch of different lineages. One of those lineages ended up in southern Africa, and then that lineage diversified, you can see that in blue on this chart, into a bunch of different tribes within the family. And then one of those tribes, well, a cluster of those tribes, you can see down, my mouse here, yeah, you can see down here, ended up coming back to the Americas and would eventually lead to the lineage that includes sunflowers and coreopsis and the Rudbeckia that's on your table. And I encourage you to actually look closely at those so you can see, it's it's not that uncommon of a fact, but it's cool to see like that the flower is composed of all these tinier flowers. So Asteraceae is the largest plant family, except maybe for orchids. There's some debate back and forth, but definitely in temperate North America where we are, Asteraceae is the largest plant family. It accounts for about 10% of all angiosperms. So angiosperms comes from the Greek for encased seed. People usually refer to these as flowering plants, but I like to think of them as fruiting plants because I think it's a little more general and it kind of connects to some of the concepts we're going to talk about. So the archetypical, right, the iconic angiosperm, in my opinion, is something like this. So you've got a cherry tree, and it has cherry blossoms. The flowers produce nectar and pollen, and they have this relationship with insects who eat the nectar, eat the pollen, and also then provide this service to the plant called pollination, right? So they move pollen grains from one flower to another that helps the plant reproduce. The other relationship that animals are going to have with angiosperms is dispersal. So you eat the cherry, you spit the pit out, that's the seed to a new cherry tree, right? Pretty simple. So this is like old news, right? You guys know about this part, right? The butterflies and the bees, they drink the nectar from the flower, and in the process they pollinate the flower so the flower gets to reproduce. This is something you guys probably have known since elementary school. It's really old news. In fact, it is 150 or so million years old, that whole process. So, you know, that might seem like a long time, but this is 500 million years, which is how long plants have been on land. So as long as we've had plants on the surface of the earth is in white, and the plants that have flowers, which by the way is almost every plant you've ever heard of except for pine trees and things like that, arose in this pink section at the top in the last 150 million years or so. So in that time, we've got this huge diversity of plants that have formed, you know, 300,000 species. And you know what you're seeing here is a lot of the diversity of the different flowers that these plants have. But there's things that aren't on here that might surprise you to know that they have flowers. So every type of grass has a flower, and all grasses are angiosperms. They're in this group too. Like I said earlier, every plant, most of the plants that you could think of are on here. There are things that aren't in angiosperms, like ferns are not angiosperms, pine trees, certain types of reeds are not angiosperms. But most of the plants that you think about when you think about plants are, and importantly, every plant you've ever eaten, except for maybe pine nuts and the berries, the juniper berries that they use to flavor gin. Every other plant you've ever eaten is in this group, and this accounts for the vast majority of plants on Earth now. This group arose, like we said, in the Cretaceous period. So this is older than some of the dinosaurs, and in that time, it arose in the early Cretaceous, and by the end of the Cretaceous, angiosperms accounted for 70% of all land plants. So they went from nothing to being like 70%. And there's a good reason for that, which we'll continue to see. But they came to dominate. There are a few places on Earth that have ecosystems that aren't dominated by angiosperms, but they're very rare and they tend to be on isolated islands. So, you know, these flowers are obviously useful for insects to get nectar, and this relationship is well understood. So at the same time in the Cretaceous that angiosperms are diversifying, we see a huge variety of insect lineages appear, but not just insects, also their predators like spiders. start to diversify wildly at the same time that flowering plants start to diversify. So you might be able to see there's a crab spider down at the bottom of that flower waiting for some luckless bee to stop for a drink. But it's not always just about the flowers, right? So there are other examples of this same kind of relationship that I'm going to continue to argue is actually pretty deep and cool as hell, actually, once you get into it. So these are oak catkins. So these are the flowers on an oak tree. They're pretty nondescript, and they actually don't really produce nectar. They do produce pollen that they let blow in the wind, and they don't really depend on insects for their pollination. But the oak also produces acorns, of course, right? So this is probably familiar to you guys, right? Some animals eat acorns, some animals bury acorns, and then so oaks get to spread. So can anyone give me an example of an animal that might eat acorns and bury acorns? Squirrel, right. Gray squirrels, perfect example. I wouldn't put it past a dog to eat acorns. People eat acorns. They're good to eat, some of them. So, right, the squirrel collects acorns, buries them, and then if it forgets about some of them or if it dies, the oak tree got planted for free, right? But it's actually not squirrels doing most of the planting of acorns or chipmunks or other rodents. In fact, it's blue jays, well, jays in general. There are 8 species of jay in North America and about 40 species worldwide. The average blue jay might collect 4,500 acorns in a season and bury them, and it only retrieves about a quarter of those. So that means in an average season, a blue jay may have planted 3,400 or so oak trees. So that's pretty good. We know about the evolutionary lineage of jays. They share a common ancestor. All these 40 species of jays on Earth share a common ancestor that would have lived in what's now Southeast Asia about 60 million years ago, which is interesting. So there's the 60 million years in blue. And that's actually the same time and place when the common ancestor of all oak trees would have lived. So scientists think that this mutualism is really ancient and goes right back to the beginning, 60 million years ago. You have some primordial oak tree and some primordial jay. The acorns are the right size for the jay to eat, and the jays develop the behavior over millions of years to bury them. So the oaks get spread all over the world, wherever jays go. So this is a distribution map of oak trees. A bunch of different groups of them, but the jay is probably responsible for planting most oak trees on Earth right now. And in fact, the jay has several adaptations for eating acorns. So the hook on their beak allows them to peel the shell of the acorn back. And they also have an extension to their esophagus called a gular pouch, where they can hold up to 5 acorns at a time in their throat. So they're sort of loud and annoying birds, right? Like they make that pretty grating squawk, but I think that's a small price to pay considering like pretty much every oak tree, if you round up, every oak tree that you've ever seen was planted by a jay. So there's the evolutionary adaptations with the jay and the oak are very specific. It's a very tight bond between those two types of animals. But there's lots of examples of this, and there's a more broad pattern going on here. So what we're seeing are visible light and ultraviolet spectrum images of flowers. And so you can see that there are patterns on the petals that we can't see, but that birds and insects can see, that can see in ultraviolet light. So there's 2 things happening there, right? So there's the insect is developing a sensitivity to ultraviolet light at the same time that the flower is developing these patterns to attract the insect. So it's like it's baked deep in their biology. It's not just that the insects find a flower that happens to feed them. It's that the insect is designed to eat from the flower, it's designed to pollinate the flower, and the flower is designed to feed the insect. And by designed here, I mean that in a strictly metaphorical sense. It's natural selection, isn't it? But it's not just birds and insects. There's many mammals are frugivores, and in fact, in our own evolutionary history, at some point in our lineage, we would have been tree-dwelling frugivores, eating mostly fruit. You might know that dogs and cats don't have full color vision, right? They can't tell red and green apart. It's thought that color vision, where we can see red, evolved in primates specifically to be able to pick out ripe fruit on a green background. So this is in us too, right? This story of angiosperms diversifying and creating this huge diversity of animals, we're also part of that story. And it's a beautiful thing, right? Like, it's literally beautiful, but it's also like, it's beautiful, right? So there's this co-benefit, or there's this almost, I think of it like a handshake. There's this agreement between fruiting plants and modern animals, where the plant says, I will feed you, right? So plants are chemical factories. They have this ability that animals don't have, which is that plants can make their own food. It's an amazing thing. On the other hand, animals have this ability that plants don't have, which is that we can move. So the plant says, I will feed you, and the animal says, I can move for you. So I can move a grain of pollen from the flower of one plant to the flower of another. I can move an acorn from one forest to another, or from one continent to another, right? So remember when we were talking about Asteraceae, they evolve in South America, then Africa, back to North America. That is likely on the backs of animals, or in the guts of animals. So, I'm thinking of this as like a really deep mutualism, and I want to contextualize it in line with other really important innovations in evolution that have this quality, where you have different organisms working together to create something bigger and more interesting and more sophisticated. So this is a close-up inside a eukaryote cell. A eukaryote is a cell that has a nucleus and mitochondria. So we're all eukaryotes. So is every plant, so is every mushroom. And the thing we're looking at there on the slide is a mitochondria. And you guys know what a mitochondria is, right?
Powerhouse of the cell.
It's the powerhouse of the cell. That's right, that's right. So the mitochondria is super important for all kinds of energetic functions in the cell. And some of you will know this, but it's really fascinating. The mitochondria actually have their own DNA that's separate from your DNA. So you have mitochondria in your cells that have their own DNA. And when your cells divide, the mitochondria divide inside them. But this has nothing to do with the human genome. There's DNA inside these things that tells them how to be mitochondria. That has nothing to do with the 46 chromosomes that you have. And the reason that they have their own DNA is because at some point in the deep past, they were separate organisms that were incorporated into a larger cell that was probably trying to eat them, but it didn't digest them, and it just lived inside this larger cell, and that cell would go on to produce every plant, animal, and fungus that we know about today. So this is another one of these handshakes, right? So this is actually a different organism than the cell it lives inside, but it's become part of its host. And actually the same thing happened in plants with chloroplasts. So that's what these little green dots are. And same thing, the chloroplast has its own DNA that's separate from the genome of the plant, that divides separately from the plant. And it's thought that at some point in the deep past again, chloroplasts were free-floating, photosynthetic, single-cell organisms that were incorporated into a larger organism, and that's where we get plant cells. And I think you could also add to this list like multicellularity at all, right? The fact that there are organisms that contain more than one cell. So we know that life started as single-celled organisms. At some point, multiples of those cells stuck together and worked toward this common goal. So I want to position what's happening with angiosperms actually in the same category. And I'm not sure what to call it. I mean, inflorescence comes to my mind, but I think we could have a rich conversation about exactly how to define it. But I think there is something, I think the fact that flowers exist and what they do and how they function is actually on par with these other big steps in evolution. So, when you see a field of wildflowers, I think there's the initial aesthetic beauty, right? But there's also more layers to it. So, this is beautiful. It's attractive to look at. You want to go up and look at these flowers. If you smell them, they smell really nice. And all of that is on purpose. All of that is signals to attract animals of different kinds, mostly insects in this case. But one way you can think about this is that the colors and the fragrances of flowers is something that was bred into them by insects. So insects are literally selectively breeding plants to become more brightly colored, to smell better, to be more beautiful. They don't know they're selectively breeding them, right? But the decisions that a bee makes about which flower to pollinate cause that flower to reproduce or not. So they've been selectively breeding plants for millions of years. And again, you see this and just understand that plants are inviting something to eat them, right? Which, I don't know about you, but to me that's incredible. Like, what in nature wants to be eaten, right? It's a short list, and it really comes down to angiosperms. Like, fruit and nectar are the only things in nature that want you to eat them, right? Because they get this mutual co-benefit. So flowers are for insect eyes, right? In terms of their aesthetics, in terms of their fragrance. The fruit is for birds and frugivorous mammals and other kinds of animals that eat them. But we're part of that. So flowers are for you too. Where are we on time?
We have time for questions.
Yeah, let's do some questions.
Yeah, we got one right